Well, I think it's time to get started, so guess we better. Welcome, everyone. Looks like we're joined by Dave Long and Gary Covine on remotely. Hopefully we'll be joined by one or two more within the next little while. We're one short of a quorum. But we'll go ahead and start with our guest discussion from the Burwood group.
Yeah.
And we have John here from there to lead that discussion. So.
Yep, great, thank you. So just for housekeeping, we've got till quarter till, right? For this quarter till, for our part of the discussion, part of the agenda, 9:45, right? I just don't want to overdo my time.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just for some background, because I don't know how much folks know about what we were asked to do. We got involved in discussions late this summer, so about 3 months ago now, to come in and take a look at the UTN, so talk to UETN leadership, just the services that are being offered, make some recommendations around, what we see as thank you, what the future ought to be. So we conducted an assessment over a couple of months here, primarily done by myself, one of my colleagues who's not here today, and we'll go through that today. We've got a relatively detailed report that's been provided. There's some detail in this deck as well. This goes about 50 slides. Given the time, we're only going to go through the summary, so about the first 14, 15 slides of this. So I'll do most of the talking, most likely. But feel free to interrupt, ask questions along the way as we get into this, but we'll try to stay on time. So, I don't know, Lisa, Ray, is there any background you wanted to give before we get into this?
Yeah, just to let the board know that, again, we were wanting to have an outside group come in and take a look at the Utah Telehealth Network portion of our organization and help us to, it's kind of like what we did with UEN when I first started here, to give us an idea of what our strengths are, perhaps our weaknesses are, and some of the recommendations of where we could improve. So it's been a good experience working with the Burwood group, and we appreciate you being here.
Yep, thank you. So just what were we here to do? Why are we trying to do this? So taking a look at the existing service catalog that UTN offers, assess how they're performing, what's the feasibility, essentially what should stay in that service catalog, what potentially could get added, what other evolutions of the organization do we see. So to do that, we wanted to get with various stakeholder groups, partners, customers, et cetera, the team themselves, of course, just to run that assessment and then come up with our recommendations. What do we think? What do we think the future holds? So what did we actually do? About 20 people. That number's not 100% accurate, but we met with a bunch of different experts. Those were either one-on-one interviews or we did some group-based workshops, whether those be actual member sites, various partner organizations, or somewhat interested organizations like health departments, et cetera. We talked with the internal staff, of course, and kind of brought our own external research to bear. That took a couple of months to get through, about 8 weeks. Then there were some iterations of findings with the team. We've done some readouts to smaller subsets of groups, and then there was an advisory council retreat last week that we also read this out to. So that brings us up to basically right here. Bit of an eye chart, but this is most of what we covered. There's some things that happened after the 10th of September that are not on here, but this gives you an idea of the who had input in terms of when we get to the part about what we heard. This is probably who we were hearing it from if it came from some of the internal or partner customer interviews we were doing, right? So like I said, those will be provided. So if there's specific questions about did you talk to XYZ, you can validate that. So what did we hear? What did we find? It's obvious that UTN is part of the safety net apparatus for rural healthcare here in Utah. It's also obvious that a lot of free market dynamics don't apply in terms of the customer-buyer relationship for some of these folks. So as far as setting prices, need for subsidy, et cetera, that's all very much there, and I think to some degree is pretty much understood. As such, the value of UTN, it does differ, and we could pick up on some of that conflict over time. If somebody was, say, a rural health center or of any kind that was affiliated with say a for-profit like an HCA kind of national provider, the SafeNet dynamic didn't work as well as if you're talking about some of the standalone so-called Rural 9 or facilities like that. So, it's just worth acknowledging within the member base that when we're soliciting for feedback, the feedback's going to change. So we've got a sort of a narrow customer base, and we'll get to that in a minute. UTN plays a general role, and I think this is also well understood as an advocate for for telehealth statewide, and that's good. We understand that they're not a lobbying entity, so we have to be careful as we move forward with recommendations that we're not directly as UETN lobbying state legislature for some things. But I think just there's sort of an undefined general acknowledgement of this advocacy role. And so there was a lot of talk around potential future role as this concept of a neutral convener organization. So we're not a lobbyist, but, and it even came up in the advisory council retreat last week, hey, a lot of us seem to be in the same places, talking about the same things, talking about similar overlapping opportunities, whether it was a particular specialty care or a particular public health initiative or whatever. And so UTN seems to find themselves in a natural fit to sort of be the coalescing point around a lot of those things. So what we were calling kind of unowned problems, and we'll get into some specific examples of some of those things, and even some more came up last week just with the group where, hey, it would be great if we had a little support around building a program for a number of different things. And even the health department folks that were representing us, representing that group last week were sort of leaning in and saying, yeah, we'd love to throw in and help with that. And so there's a lot of overlap there. It's just sort of not as defined potentially as it could be. Similarly, it's like the rural healthcare gaps. They're known, but exactly what we're going to do about it is difficult to quantify at times. And again, back to this potential, we talk about the evolution of the role of UTN, the ability to really own building some of those programs or products, as it were, and bring those to, I'll keep saying the rural health, but really it could be any sort of community health application as we move forward, and really doesn't need to be limited to Utah, but we'll start slow there. So as such, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the need to better define a marketing plan. Marketing more clearly to customers, to stakeholders, particularly stakeholders. And I talked a little bit last week about how even having telehealth in the name, and I'm not suggesting a complete relogo, rebranding, or anything like that, but even having telehealth in the name is something of a misnomer. Because although that's how it started, and that was the impetus, late 90s, post-deregulation, this is what we're going to bring to the table, that's really not what UETN is doing today. There's still some holdouts of some direct telehealth application or video application that's being provided by UTN to the member organizations. But really what's going on is UTN is delivering managed internet connectivity. They're a managed internet services provider for rural healthcare facilities across the state of Utah. And we'll talk about that service and why that's important. But I think from a marketing to stakeholder groups, particularly like Intermountain or the University Health, they don't want to feel like they're in competition with UTN around delivering actual telehealth services. They feel they've got the clinical capability, they've got the specialty services they're trying to extend throughout rural healthcare. That's what they want to do. And there really isn't a conflict. I think maybe it's just a little more psychological around, from how it started and the fact that telehealth's in the name. Back to the safety net apparatus type thing. If I were going to message back to anyone, legislature, stakeholders, what we're really doing, we are that managed internet provider for the rural healthcare. We're a safety net managed internet provider for rural healthcare institutions. And what does that really mean? Well, that means they get access to EHRs. They have access to the internet. That's how they code procedures. That's how they bill, right? So it's a necessary imperative to run a hospital or any kind of healthcare entity at this point. And that's what UTN is providing. They are providing critical infrastructure to actually run a healthcare business, right? So I think when we look at some of that marketing back to the stakeholder groups, what we're basically saying is, hey, we're building roads, and the roads is the infrastructure, the managed internet. We want you, Intermountain, University Healthcare, whoever else, to drive your vehicles across those roads, and that's teleneuro, whatever it's going to be. It's any package you could think of to extend specialty care, and it doesn't have to only be specialty care, but that's often what we think of. But essentially to drive resources virtually across those roads into all four corners of the state, right? And so, while I think a lot of folks understand that that's kind of the dynamic, the UTN and would-be provider dynamic, it was clear when we were having some of the conversations, it was just like, look, we don't want to be in competition for some of that. We just want that to be as frictionless experience as possible, right? So us as the road builders, I think when we reach out, we need to understand that the members are our customers, but in some ways, those potential providers of specialty services are kind of like a customer, they're a user of our roads, right? So if they want a 2-lane or a 4-lane or asphalt or blacktop, we have to understand what that is and make that as frictionless an experience as possible, and I think there's opportunity for improvement there. So I talked about the narrow range of current customers, and that's, given the current offering, that's just how it's going to be, right? Back to that safe and apparatus, you've got a handful of healthcare clinics, hospitals, et cetera, public health departments that simply can't go into the free market and get the IT infrastructure. Their IT infrastructure needs 100% met to keep up with what they need to do, and that's a small group. It's the almost 80 members that are in the membership today, and that's not really going to change based on that need for subsidized high-speed internet connectivity, right? So when we talk about evolution of customers and new opportunities, we're going to talk about, well, what else can we do beyond that, right? So and we'll get to that. The rural community members definitely mentioned across the board, hey, if there were other services that sort of came with this that we could layer into that, and were similarly sort of right-sized for us in terms of our ability to, we'd still pay for them. Obviously, we can only pay so much, but if they're right-sized for what we need for how we would consume them, be happy to work with UTN and figure out how to do that, and we've got some couple of examples there. And so that came up, but again, we have to keep in mind that this is going to be as long as we're talking about managed IT services for those groups, we're always going to be sort of in this narrow swim lane of who potentially would want to use them, and what we can offer.
So you do have examples,
Yeah.
of what those services would be, and I know you don't have to.
Yeah, like for instance, though, just to get ahead of it, like what UTN does, which is slightly separate than what traditional UEN has done in terms of managed connectivity. One thing that's a big differentiator on the telehealth network side is provision of security services, which is necessary for a hospital or any healthcare entity, right? You need encryption and privacy and HIPAA law, et cetera. So, for instance, right now that includes a managed firewall service. So we deliver firewall services that we manage and configure on behalf as part of the service. That includes some third-party connectivity services. It includes vulnerability scans. So we will provide to the member organization a vulnerability scan that says, hey, you've got some security posture that's risky or not what we'd like to see, et cetera. And it sort of stops there. And a really good example of that would be, well, can I maybe buy some services, call it consulting service, something to say, it's great that you told me I have vulnerabilities. You haven't told me exactly what to do about it, right? And if I'm a rural hospital with limited staff and maybe don't have security expertise, it's sort of like, hey, you told me I have a problem, but you didn't tell me how to fix it, right? That's a perfect example to be able to layer in some additional services. I think the total market there is going to be small, limited, right? But it's still an opportunity to engage and drive a little bit of incremental revenues, into the UETN and just perform the mission, help out the role. So that's an example of something like that. Yeah, no problem. So I talked a little bit about this, right? The healthcare delivery organizations, they see their domain as the delivery of the clinical workflow, the provision of care, right? So they don't want to be in competition with us on that front. We just kind of covered that. And I think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate to let that be their domain at this point, right? They're gonna provide the technology, the necessary workflow that's going to be able to provision care physically, virtually, over distance, whatever, and that's their domain. So I think moving forward, we need to be looking at ways to, again, make that as frictionless an experience as possible, and that's just going to be better advocacy, outreach, partnership, whatever, with the stakeholders at those places, right? So when we talk about, so where do we go from here, and we'll get into that. We found, from the point of view of the rural communities and others, there's this overlap, this sort of unowned overlap of potential initiative between a bunch of different things. But we talked through, like, for instance, healthcare and education. This works out really well for UETN, where I've got a lot of healthcare initiatives that are being driven by the State Board of Education, for student health. And I've got a lot of other access to healthcare resources initiatives that might be being driven by the public health department. And that also rolls into the initial sort of inception of UTN, its mission, right? So just through the process of interviewing some of these folks, we stumbled onto a program that is struggling right now on the education side, the Board of Education side, which was they have a funding and an initiative to drive behavioral health out to the schools, right? And that, I forget what their total budget was, but it was something on hiring 80 plus licensed clinical social workers to partner with schools and school nurses to essentially make sure we had behavioral health at all schools across the state. Right? They're struggling because difficult to hire those folks, and then physically locate them where they need to be to meet that need. Right? This is a tailor-made application for telehealth, or what UTN was built to be. Right? And so, unaware of each other, these opportunities existed, that there was a struggle with providing and sourcing resources. We've got the reach from a healthcare perspective, and so we've got experience in standing up tele or virtual delivery of resources into healthcare. We've got the hooks into the UEN side because we're managing those circuits right now. We're already doing learning over distance, virtual classrooms, et cetera, et cetera. It's a perfect opportunity to maybe look at how do we reallocate some of those funds and partner up and go deliver that. That we sort of see in the future of UTN. That's those types of applications, that kind of product development is where the team should probably be focused on. So this is a little bit of a recap in terms of the services that are being offered today. One thing I didn't touch on, I mentioned about how the managed internet capability really is imperative for, I'll just say a hospital, but any healthcare facility, but a hospital to run their business today. You have to have connectivity to an electronic health record. There's a bunch of other reasons why you need connectivity to other organizations well beyond telehealth. Before we even start scratching the surface on telehealth, just to run the IT apparatus of my institution, I'm going to need this. UTN is providing it. Above and beyond that, there's a big unquantified, unrationalized bulk of support going on where a member hospital can call into UTN and say, look, I've got a problem, an IT infrastructure problem, and I need help with it. And that's going on day by day, week by week, month by month. That's just happening, right? So there's this sort of unquantified help desk support, safety net support going on where the UTN team is sort of just, they're augmenting local IT staff where we either won't hire or can't hire locally. We know that we can lean on UTN for that help. And so that's good. It's good that it's getting done. It's bad that it's helping us. It's preventing us from creating any kind of operational efficiency to really create any breathing room to do the things we're talking about we might want to do. Right? So that's something that we've got to solve for, and we'll talk about how we think we might want to do that. Security services, we talk about what's going on there. But across the board, I didn't really hit on this. I mean, the value, the quantification of value from the members around UTN, overwhelmingly satisfied with the service. I mean, we didn't hear any dissent from everyone we talked to out in the communities around, hey, we love UTN, we love what they're doing, we love the support, couldn't do what we're doing without them. So I think that needs to be mentioned, and we obviously have to keep that in place. As whatever we do, whatever we bolt on from here to do more, get better, that can't change. Any questions before we move on there? So, just driving into sort of what we're recommending here. Our recommendations are really going to fall into a couple different swim lanes. One is around improving and stabilizing the current operation. So, we'll call that creating breathing room. Part of that's going to be, the funding that we have in hand, securing that, prioritizing it, making sure that we're fiscally solvent, for sure. So rationalizing the existing core service. I talked about that core service of managed internet. That can't go away. It can't get worse, right? We have to keep delivering that. That's necessary for rural care to continue to operate. So that's important. But I also talked about gaining operational efficiency, right? Like right now, we've got a lot of unquantified work that's going on. We don't have. I mean, it's anecdotal. We can quantify it. When I go and talk to every individual, we've got great examples of what I did today to help out, or what I did last week to help out this particular institution because they had a local area network challenge or a firewall challenge or whatever. That's all anecdotal, but it's hard to gain any efficiency around that when we kind of don't know what's coming, right? So if I'm sitting here going, I don't know what I'm going to do next week, but I know I'm going to help somebody, it's hard to plan for that. Right? So the nearer term recommendations are all going to be around just gaining an operational efficiency, gaining that breathing room. As we move forward and transforming the organization, some of the things I talked about, what is the new role? What are some of the new projects and products we can take on, more that neutral convener concept. How do we actually formalize that and then take that forward? So we talked a little bit about moving forward with any kind of state-based funding request, just better quantifying what it is the group's really actually doing right now. I don't know what the impact, I can't put a dollar figure to the financial impact of that, but again, getting away from that telehealth moniker, it's fine if that's the moniker, but just framing the whole operation to what it really is, right? A safety net apparatus for rural healthcare IT. Plus an augmentation, we're essentially central, where we would have had to hire expertise and put them into the field in these rural areas. We're not doing that because we've got this centralized body at UTN that they can call into and get that help, right? So in a lot of ways, we're augmenting the IT staff that would have been spread around the state, right? So I just think as long as when we're going forward with any funding requests or we're framing up or characterizing what it is this group actually does, I think that's important because I think it'll just help underpin any future requests.
So just a thought about that. I don't, when you talk about envision a new role, I don't know that that's a new role. That's a role that has been done and done well.
Yeah.
It's kind of paring down and focusing the role, clarifying what the role is, and becoming less diffuse and more focused. Yeah. So I'm afraid that could be a little bit misleading when we think about a new role. We're not creating anything new. We're simply clarifying the role and what is done best.
Yeah, so sorry for misspeaking. So on the stabilize and rationalize here, this essentially is around, that's a better way to say it, clarifying the role. So none of this is new that's on this slide. We're essentially saying these are the things we're doing today, and we're going to either clarify what we're doing, or we're going to rationalize something we're doing today and say, you know what, that's really, so maybe this is a change of the role, or we're going to maybe opt out of certain services that aren't really working or aren't as widely consumed, right? So for sort of the items 1 and 3, that's the core service, right? So I think item 1 is clarifying for everyone who's not us what it is we're really doing there, and rationalizing that item 3 is necessary, right? So network connectivity, security support, getting circuits, and doing the discount administration, like that is absolutely fundamental. It has to be there. Yeah. So that's great. I mentioned the State Board of Education, the ability to sort of partner because that's here now. Those meetings are already set up, I think, for next month, just to talk through how we might work. I mean, they're struggling. We have capabilities to productize what they need to do. Obviously, we'd ask for probably some help. I mean, there could be easily a few resources from that funding added to this group just to help set that up. That becomes go ahead.
Well, my question about that is that it seems to me that adding those resources to this group may be less efficient than actually partnering with a group who already employs social workers and has all of that. It's just a matter of being sort of the convener or the facilitator of bringing resources that exist out there and bringing them into this particular role. I don't think it would be the best use of actually going out and hiring social workers and starting to run that kind of a program. That's not an easy thing to do. So I would say be partnering with those organizations that already do that.
Yeah, not suggesting that this group would hire the social worker resources. What I'm saying is if you look at the existing program that's struggling on their side, it's meant to hire bodies and physically locate them into the field, as it were. Mm-hmm. We're sort of saying, and they're hitting a wall. They're realizing that's maybe not feasible as written. So we're sort of saying, well, look, you want to extend resources from where they physically live virtually to where they're needed. That requires technology. We're already really good at doing that because we do that with classrooms, we do that with teachers, we do that with healthcare resource. So if you're willing to take some of that funding and move it over to, I'll call it just a technology bucket, right? Because we're going to have to provide technology to do it that way, the virtual way. We're happy to help be the technology arm of that. As you then, maybe it's a bunch of social workers wherever they're going to live, but we're not employing them. That was the thought process.
You're providing the technology to connect those social workers with the sites that need them.
Yeah, the existing program has no technology component whatsoever. It was literally, I'm going to interview, hire 80 plus social workers and then locate them throughout the state, and they're realizing that the logistics of that are not real feasible at the moment. Yeah.
Okay.
So we talked about rationalizing some services, and this kind of goes along with my kind of roads and cars anecdote. Transitioning out of the physical video conferencing equipment and hardware, there's still some holdouts or people that are using that type of thing. It's very difficult to do. We have a lighter weight video conferencing capability that the team's developed called UTN Connect. So I think we continue with those media services because that's easy to support and extend to whoever needs it. It doesn't require expensive hardware. It doesn't require lifecycle management. What happens when the hardware gets old or breaks, et cetera, et cetera. And so because that's been difficult to do, and a lot of the physical video, particularly where there's a clinical workflow tied to it, the physical equipment is being provided by the clinical organization who's bringing those operations to bear, Intermountain University Healthcare, whatever. So that we see that as not a good fit to transition out of that. So we're maintaining the core infrastructure, the roads as it were. We're maintaining UTN Connect as a lightweight option, again, with our narrow band of customers that need sort of creative, subsidized and or right-sized approaches for what they need to do. That's a good fit. But we get out of the hardware game where video is concerned. Sorry, was there a question? No. One thing that came up quite a bit was the amount of, and this is down in the weeds a little bit, but the amount of bandwidth that we're provisioning into the sites. And there's some disparity, because it's always kind of a one-off, not really, but you're negotiating point in time every time you're putting out an RFP to go get circuits just to put them in, right? And so you're dealing with whatever the market's coming back with at that particular time. This much bandwidth costs this much dollars. And so that makes it more difficult to standardize and say we're always going to put 1 gigabit of connectivity in all the time, because that might be cost prohibitive. Partnering up with the work that UEN's done and broadening out that negotiating capability across all those things, we feel like, sort of been quantified, that we can get to a place where gigabit circuits can be the preferred, almost default option across the board. There's some hardware considerations, and there's ways around that being a barrier. So just in the interest of, this was a big deal, just in the interest of standardizing, we're sort of saying going forward, that's our default operating mode. We're gonna submit for and provision a gigabit of connectivity everywhere and build that standard.
Could I ask a question, Jim? As far as going back to number 5, was there any consideration that UETN would continue to play that role for public ed and higher ed?
It wasn't part of the...
Well, I'm just thinking the fact that UEN would continue to still do what's on number 5, right?
Right, yeah, we continue to do that.
And so it's not like UETN as a whole organization would benefit from doing away. You're just recommending that they not do that for the telehealth
Within the
portion.
healthcare segment.
But UEN would continue to still do number 5. So I guess my question is, if they're continuing to do it, if resources are still being expended, is there still a need out there with these rural hospitals and centers to benefit from the relationships that UETN has with vendors, software technology providers? Is there still a benefit since they're going to do it anyway?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the possible answer to that is yes, with a caveat. And as we move into this next set of recommendations, which is around gaining operational efficiency, we talked a lot about, okay, UEN has this network operations center. It's well-staffed, well-instrumented. They're handling first call for the education side of support requests. UTN, very specialized in healthcare, which has also some very different needs. They're handling first call requests on a smaller team. And there's some other things going on around, you need 24/7 support, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of gaining operational efficiency, an obvious one is once you get into detail, obviously, is where it starts to break down. We say, why isn't that support apparatus combined, right? Why don't we leverage, we've got a lot more nodes on the network on the UEN side than you do on the UTN side. You've got, a service desk and tools over here. You've got a smaller team over there. Just put it together. So a couple barriers to that are the two main ones were the network operations center on the UEN side is not a 24/7 because they're not supporting 24/7 facilities. That's changing, right? So that's being scaled up. So there's a bit of, there's some change that has to happen on the traditional UEN side as well. The other side of it is there's not a built-in awareness of the security and compliance requirements and the full stack of security technology that's being used on the healthcare side. So if I'm going to say, and I think we've got buy-in on this, I'm going to flatten out my support organization and have sort of one front door to the organization for no matter who you are, school or hospital. In order to do that, I'm going to have to staff up the UEN side to make sure I'm 24/7. I'm also going to have to do some education to make sure that whoever's taking first call is not just aware of what we do on the education side, but they also understand what we're doing and what the requirements are on the healthcare side. I think if we get to a place where that's working well, you could talk about retrofitting potentially what UEN's doing on the video side back into the healthcare side, or make that an offering, provided we can make the pricing work out. We felt like, and certainly there was on both the traditional UTN staff side and UEN side, there was a little bit of a, hey, I think we can do this, but this is going to take some change management. This is going to take some doing before we're ready to just take on hospital support, or from a UTN perspective, before I'm willing to sort of give over some of the support to someone, until I'm sort of, everyone's got the same level of awareness. So your point's well taken, and that may be an opportunity to layer that in later. I feel like it appears that there's been a start to bringing those support organizations together. There's already some critical function being done by the UEN staff around the internet management on the healthcare side, but it's like we just got to finish. We just haven't finished putting those organizations together, and so that's a major recommendation for gaining operational efficiency. If we came in and facilitated sort of I'll just use ITIL as an example, a service management framework that looks at, here's all the things and support workflows that are going on over here. Some of that probably needs to get documented on the UTN side. And then we run that change management exercise so that UEN's ready to go. The UEN NOC takes over full support. Now, what we'll probably have to do, though, we talked about this last week, there's a third party that would be probably a little concerned about this, and that's either the UTN network members themselves or their advocates, right? I used to have a very almost one-to-one relationship with my support person. When I move into more of a network operations center mode, I'm going to lose that. And so we have to make sure we carve out the right kind of support. And I was using a pod concept for any kind of a service center. So we create like a UTN pod within the service center, so we have a smaller group in the NOC that knows, the healthcare calls. Maybe not first call, but if it's like an escalation route here. What I really think we're going to get out of this, though, is better metrics, better data in terms of, on the healthcare side, how many calls are coming in a given month, what's the nature of those calls, how long did it take, how long were they open, how long, what could we close on a first request. We can also retroactively look at, where is our percentage of support time being spent, right? So if I know I'm spending 33% of my support time on the same kind of stuff, I can get ahead of that. I can create a wiki or self-service options, or maybe there's just maybe something we're doing based on a particular configuration that's making this support necessary. So that's going to get us the breathing room to have a couple of resources focused on some of the other things we want to do. For instance, if we stand up a virtual licensed clinical social worker operation that requires, maybe it's UTN Connect that's doing that, I can't do that today if I don't have any extra resources. If I gain a little efficiency here, I can dedicate some time to those types of things, building new products, right? So that's the idea.
John,
Yes.
during the retreat for the UTN, I thought we had an example from and Mars, maybe you can speak of it. I think it was Wayne County Hospital, and they actually looked at the two. Do we go ahead and get additional equipment through UTN, or do we do something else? And they chose to use Zoom, actually. So that was their solution. My point is that they reviewed both, and I think that's what it was Wayne County, and he spoke.
I believe you're right.
He commented, but my point was he reviewed both. Do we go into additional equipment, or do we do a software solution? They chose for them, the right solution for them was to go ahead and not to do the equipment, to go to Zoom. So I just think they're looking at both things.
Yeah, that's a good point. But we would be we're competing more with the free market there than we are in some of these other infrastructure, like managed internet, for instance. It's a good point.
Can I ask a good question?
Sure, Deb.
You talked about preferring a gig, but that sounds a little bit different than what you talked about in the retreat.
So based on price, it's still going to be, everything is different. Every procurement exercise is a procurement exercise. So if the
Sure.
cost isn't the cost, what we were saying was, because particularly from the work that Lisa's done, we've been able to flatten out, and in some instances, gig connectivity is coming down. We're sort of saying we're trying to manage the gig as a standard, provided it's feasible. There are going to be times when it's not.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What we did do was what we actually looked at in all different areas, and it's not a perfect solution for every telco, I will say that, but for most telcos, when we start averaging what the cost is and what it's costing,
Right.
you know, assuming we can do it, we generally, we generally found that the gig solution was actually cheaper than anything else. Generally speaking, and like I said, there's one telco that I'm gonna say that we're not quite there yet, but generally speaking, it seems like to me that, and I think that's what we were looking at. We were actually going through, and I was just using state contract act pricing is actually was my method, not looking at what UTN negotiated, what our state contract is. And that's what we were kind of finding where we were as of right now. So,
Well, yeah. I mean, when a gig is affordable, we've been going for it for sure.
There's so on the healthcare side, and it's again, this is a little bit in the weeds. On the healthcare side, there's some implication to that. The higher the bandwidth, because we're providing more equipment, i.e. firewalls, than you wouldn't have on the education side. And those themselves have performance, throughput, limitations, capabilities, right? So in some of those instances, we may be provisioning a gig, but not using the whole thing because we don't want to have to necessarily buy really, really expensive firewalls to put on site for a clinic that's only staffed twice a week or something, right? So we'll have to, there'll be some one-off there. But what that does do is a couple of things. It future-proofs us a little bit as bandwidth requirements are naturally going to continue to grow. And as we look at, and this came up a little bit last week, other technology architecture capabilities, more cloudified solutions, et cetera, where we're not putting as much equipment on-prem, but we're starting to centralize it or it goes off to the cloud someplace else. Those bigger, faster pipes will help us deliver those services more reliably. So that was the thought process there. But good questions. This is actually the last slide. As far as transforming the organization, so what do we add? We talked about not losing focus on the core services. So fast managed internet, discount and subsidy services, all the procurement services that go with that, firewall services, security services, right? So that's for sure. The neutral convener role, there was little to no appetite for anything that had to do with sort of like value-based care, value-based purchasing. However, wherever we could attach to a use case, so some kind of epidemic, some kind of crisis, some kind of need, the Board of Education's licensed clinical social worker need to extend them virtually. Well, they need to have them, and we're saying you could extend them virtually. That's a perfect example. That becomes a model that works for a number of different use cases. So we're not necessarily standing up the value-based care telehealth organization or value-based care support organization. We're sort of saying, look, if we can do this for one particular use case, this will also work with certain chronic disease, diabetes. Right? So it's not. I think it's an opportunity to show cross-organization cooperation on some of these things. Where we just say, look, lean on us as sort of a shared services organization. You're always going to need connectivity. You're always going to need tech support. You're probably going to need some kind of collaboration capability. That's going to run common throughout those things, whether I'm doing diabetes, hypertension, or I'm extending licensed clinical social workers into schools, right? So if that can continue to just layer onto us, I think that helps prop up UTN as that not only just the neutral convener, but as a potentially a shared services kind of a organization. So that to number 3. If we kind of evolve a little bit. I'll call it a rural healthcare innovation center, but I think even as we go forward, we ensure that our marketing or branding doesn't limit us to only rural, doesn't limit us to only Utah. There's some other organizations across the country that started in that manner. We reference later on in the document Alliance Chicago, which is an organization we've worked with where they started out doing community health in Chicago only. Now they're national. They're in like 30 states. They provide shared EHR services, connectivity, consulting, et cetera. And they do a lot of rural, they do a lot of urban community, they do a bunch of different things, right? Because once you've sort of created a model, you can start layering the use cases on top of it. So I think that's important. We talked a little bit just now about the more we can accelerate the sort of the porting to operational support as much as possible. So we take what's working from a support perspective from UTN and we ingrain that into what's already going at UEN. We end up with this UETN Network Operations Center and Service Desk that supports all our customers, both educational and telehealth. That's going to free up the resource we need that's going to basically help us do the work in defining this new value add, defining these shared service opportunities, working on this opportunity with the Department of Education. So that's obviously going to be very important that we've just got to finish that merger, so to speak. It's been started, it just hasn't been finished. And then from there, I think we can choose to, we're not going to expand our customer base like I talked about in terms of the existing approximately 80 members from a managed internet perspective. There's just not more market for that. I can't go out and sell subsidized internet and firewall to many more people in the state of Utah. Maybe if you want to take it on more states, there's an opportunity to expand there. But that's all we're going to do. There's not much expansion that we can do. And that's always going to operate in razor thin margins, subject to discounting and subsidy, right? So that's always a tenuous place to be. So I think if we could figure out then instead how to extend new lines of service, go from just being managed provider to this kind of shared services entity. There's some detail in this document around some thoughts on where we can go. I mean, tongue in cheek, we use the shared common EHR platform. I don't think that's really good. That's a tough sell probably at this point where we're at in terms of maybe if we were earlier in the meaningful use cycle. But never say never. But that gets you thinking down a line of thinking, which is, what if we did have one common multi-tenant EHR platform that would, we could heavily gain efficiency across the state. Take that off the table for a second, but then you look at something like email. Okay, let's just look at the rural Knights. They all have email. Why do they operate 9 separate email systems? Could we consolidate that and offer a shared service? So when we talk about an innovation center, shared services center, those are the types of things we're talking about. There's no way we can do that right now with the staff maxed out and not necessarily knowing what the subject of the next call they're going to answer is going to be, right? So we port that support service over, we open some of this up, now we can start to engage with our customers. Like for instance, I think email is a great place to start. You go to the Rural 9, you say, hey, can we get together and do one common multi-tenant email platform and you all pay less? And we'll help you support it. Yes or no? You get 5 of the 9 bought in on that, and then you say, let's go, right? Partnering with the Board of Education, like I said, and say, okay, look, you're going to have to move some funding over here. We'll create the technology apparatus, which will let you deliver your social workers from, Provo and Salt Lake, or from their living room, to wherever they need to go, into the nurse's office at any school anywhere in the state. Let's go. But we're going to have to free up those resources before we can do that. And so when we talk about extending or expanding services and customer base, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. So I'm either expanding a service option within my existing membership base, because I know I can't do more managed internet elsewhere. So for instance, how about if we just take on shared services email? And there's, like I said, we got a laundry list of things to start with. And then for new customers, a new customer potentially is the Board of Education.
So just a couple of thoughts. I think this is a great report and and great work. I think that how you describe this focus, the core services, is a great description and an essential need in the world. In this rural area. But a couple of things. One is that we've talked about 9 rural hospitals, but as I look at all of the lists that UTN connects to, there's a lot of clinics and really underserved areas that depend on these services. So I wouldn't want us to lose focus on those. And as we looked at sort of the disparity in the bandwidth, so I know we kind of went over that, but there is a great opportunity there. That's something that the health systems are not going to address. They're not going to address the Gmail or the email stuff. But when you start talking about monitoring chronic disease and getting into those kinds of things, those are the things that you're going to start bumping up against the health systems who are providing those kinds of services. So I think it's just important to say we have limited resources. Think about where it makes sense to grow services and expand. And when you talk about roads and really think about that, because there is a lot of need, a lot of unmet need, and there's a lot of users that are depending on UTN to provide these services. So that's my only observation, is kind of being thoughtful about the fact that it's not just 9 hospitals, but it's all these other areas, and and kind of those services that make sense
Yeah.
to be delivered by this entity.
Yeah, I think from a guiding principles perspective, and maybe that's something we could create. I mean, we want to stay out of something where the provision of care or a clinical workflow. We we're not the primary provider of a clinical workflow or the provision of care, right? So, and that's easy to quantify when you're talking about. And sorry, I know we're a little over time here. But we'll wrap up shortly. That's an easy use case to define when you're talking about the things that Intermountain or the university wants to do in terms of extending their specialty care out to the roads. They have a good incentive to do that. So if we're creating a road that allows them to drive tele-X across that and extend their specialists that are here, Provo, or wherever they're at, great, that's easy, that's well understood. I think there's a similar corollary to something like public health department program where they might say, look, the university doesn't really care about maybe rural home-based monitoring of hypertension patients. And I'm not suggesting that this group stand up a way to create widgets or put little, whatevers out at those patient sites. And there's that technology already exists. There are people that already provide it. However, the public health department can only do so much. Those rural clinics and entities can only do so much. They might, back to that kind of convener coalescer, they might need help. Say, hey, look, maybe you use some of our roadway, or we can at least be tech support, because there's going to be technology there, but I'm not trying to engineer the solution. I'm just trying to connect the dots. Public health department wants to monitor in their homes rural hypertension patients. The local clinics and hospitals have good incentive to do this because it keeps them it keeps the patients where they need to be, and they don't have to drive, and they're not clogging up, EDs or urgent cares or whatever, right? That's a similar example. It's a less obvious but similar example to what we're doing with, I'll just say, like teleneuro, with the university or something, telestroke. There are just more parties involved, and there's a less obvious profit incentive around those types of things. So that's where I think we'll have to figure out how to work. But provided we can create the efficiency, then we can raise our hand and say, we can help build that for you, or we can take first call on support when the hypertensive rural patients going, my thing won't, whatever, they have to call a help desk and get that all sorted out. So that's an opportunity to layer other services, to your point.
On your previous slide, on gaining operational efficiency, number 7, you're talking about recruiting for the replacement when Deb leaves. What was the discussion of efficiencies there?
So that was less so about efficiency, but obviously we need leadership. But where that started was when we were thinking this through. What should the director of UTN look like? What should their background focus be? And we realized it's going to be dependent on we can't sort of engineer the perfect person. But we were sort of saying, should it be an emphasis? And originally we were saying, well, maybe that emphasis should be more on service management because we were seeing this need to gain operational efficiency. And then the more we started thinking through, more of this innovation center shared services role really probably is more of a product management role. And we have a whole that's in the report, the whole breakdown of that. So I think what we're really looking at is somebody to come in to be basically with a product management kind of a background, potentially, or at least have that ability to fill that role and be very conversant in healthcare. Because what we're talking about is product, not in the traditional bringing products to market sense, but we're talking about how to create products out of these mutual interests or just opportunities that exist. So I think we probably want someone who can come in and be more of an innovative product manager over top of this thing, and then they've got sort of a service management arm or lieutenant they can lean on. I think the service management thing will shake itself out once you go through this whole kind of, whether it's ITIL, whatever framework you want to use to say, what do we need to document that's being done by UTN today? What are those support exercises that happen? How much of that do we port or combine into the broader UETN service desk and not, maybe service management. Once we get through that and we finish that merger, maybe we realize it's not as big of a deal as we thought because we've got we've really got this service desk thing humming and we know how to take calls and escalate and get to the third tier and, page Mars after hours when we know it's something we absolutely can't do and only Mars or his team has to look at it, those types of things. So yeah, that's not really an efficiency thing other than, the team needs leadership. So we don't want a big gap there. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That's great. Well, I appreciate it. Sorry, go ahead.
Just a point of information, just to give you some ideas of some of the things we've been dealing with in the Kane School District. As you go to the state school board for some additional funding options or trying to access some of that money for social workers, 2 years ago, in the Kane School District, we applied for an elementary social worker grant. We were awarded that grant for 2 elementary schools. As we started to go through that funding and accessing the money, we come into a problem that in the legislative statute, it required us to have that person to be an employee of the district. We were unable to transfer that money to a third-party provider. And so then that became very difficult because we didn't have enough money to hire a full-time person. But there was enough money there to hire a third-party provider, and we could have provided some resources to our students. But just because of the nature of the language, we've actually had to turn that grant back to the state school board because we can't go out and find an LCSW for $44,000, but we could have done contracted hours with a third-party provider, and provide many hours of service. But I just want to, maybe you're already aware of that, but that's something that we run into in our rural area, trying to free up some of those monies for social service work.
Yeah, that good historical evidence there. We talked through that a little bit. I don't know if we'll have the exact same barrier with this opportunity, but I do expect there'll be probably a couple at-bats before we get a hit with some of these things because of that type of stuff. But building a historical case is good, because you can, for future requests, you can say, look, we tried these things in the past, and just kind of thinking it through the more traditional sense of, physical, employed, whatever, hasn't worked out. If there's a way to be more nimble with this, and we feel there is, here's how we would suggest doing it. Maybe that frames future requests for funding better. But it sounded like with this instance, we had an opportunity to maybe reframe the existing funding, so we're hoping that that's the case. That's good, good history, good background. Any other questions or comments before we wrap this section up?
So once you have done something like this, how do you suggest, in this case, UETN carry forward and implement these recommendations?
Yeah, so the first thing to start with is finalizing the support framework. So we would suggest a workshop-based approach. There's some ITIL expertise within UEN that could also be third party to just finish organizing the support apparatus, right? So that we've got 24/7 kind of single number reach, so to speak, for support, and we see how that materializes in terms of cycles freed up with the existing team. I think in parallel for some of the birds in hand we have for opportunity, the meeting's already scheduled with the Board of Education. See that through and figure out, is there a way to that's kind of a proof of concept. That's a special project. Is there a way to do something there and learn a little bit? So that's in parallel. Also in parallel is these additional services we can offer. So I think it's, again, assuming we can free up a quarter FTE, a half FTE with this operational efficiency we're talking about, does that allow that individual to engage with the existing customer base and say, okay, you know what, we can offer a little bit of consulting services around security. So we're not just giving vulnerability report, we're going to offer remediation services. Or to sit with them and say, what other shared services potentially, to use the email example, right? Is that for real? I think that's the tactical start. The harder bit, I think, is going to be around this sort of neutral convener role, and I think it's going to start with branding. So whether it's rewriting the mission statement or what, that's going to be tough. That's a leadership conversation to say, what do we really want to do there in terms of how we're going to reboot, our campaign out to our customers, our stakeholders, and I think a lot of it is bridge building with some of the, with the university in particular, with University Healthcare in particular. I mean, I found it, we didn't really cover it here because I found it interesting that Intermountain Healthcare provides an annual subsidy into this program, and the university healthcare system doesn't. Right? I mean, not that I want to walk up the hill and start finger wagging and shaming people, but it's sort of like, that's not that.
So, well, I don't know why that is.
Well, there's some.
Because we've always talked about paying for services that you access, and that's rather than subsidies, but actually paying for services. So that would be another way to look at this. So
one maybe different perspectives are allowed, right? So Intermountain says, you know what, this is a necessary sort of safety net apparatus, so we want to kick in a little something for the effort. Or you say pay for services, right? Both of those things can be right given your perspective, but I just feel it's for me, with that, so, and it maybe it's appropriate that the University of Healthcare is not doing that. However, for me, it was indicative of maybe some bridge building that ought to happen to maybe improve some relationship. And this is just John. This is not what it felt like to me was because there was history with UTN used to be part of University Healthcare IT. Just the emotional nature of that stuff and that separating is there's sensible there's friction you can sense there. It's just not on paper, right? And that's probably why Intermountain is like, oh, we don't have any problem. You're something, keep helping out. We appreciate the roads that we're driving our services across, right? So that I think that all goes with what is the branding exercise, the rewriting of the mission statement, the bridge building, the partnering we want to do. That's more squishy than those tactical recommendations.
So what role would maybe planning effort, a strategic plan, where you actually outline and assign people to follow through on these things?
Yep.
Because I've seen a lot of these reports go forward and then not really gain traction and move forward to accomplish what the recommendations are. So is that something you facilitate, or is that something
we certainly can
yourself? You know what I mean?
Yeah, we certainly can. I think for another. So yeah, you're really talking about. Well, it could be. You could do it in the same vein, but it really twofold. We would take and chunk out our. I had another slide here. We would take and chunk out our tactical and our strategic recommendations and build two separate programs, potentially. I thought we had so if I'm building a strategic plan, we create this quadrant to sort of say, what should we be going after? What are the things that make sense? And this kind of like guiding principles around if there's clinical workflow involved, like we don't want it, that type of thing. So part of the strategic plan might be a revised updated mission statement, updated branding and marketing plan, and the product management initiative to say we're gonna go after this, and this. In 6 months, I want to have a prototype built around something, and in 12 months. That's got to happen. Now, whether I want to take this whole service management, service desk consolidation thing and put that as part of that, or have it be a separate program, it's up to you guys. If it were me, I would have that be separate. Right? I feel like UTN was brought into this organization for good reason, and we just quite haven't. You see that a lot in M&A. The merger just never quite fully, and it's still a we/they kind of thing going on. I feel like potentially a third party would be useful there in the ITIL assessment because, just to smooth over all the rough parts there. I would keep separately the service desk, service management integration, and just know that we're going to get some efficiency out of it. We can, at the beginning of that, we can put some targets around it. We'll figure out we're doing this many hours a week, this many man hours a week on support calls on the UTN side, and by month one of having the service desk, we want to reduce it by 30%, let's say. Right? We'll have to figure that out. I would just have it be a standalone engagement with the success criteria being we're returning some time back to the existing staff to work on these other things.
Does UETN have a product manager?
No. That's what we're suggesting. As we move forward, and Deb eventually does want to retire. That maybe is a big part of the, as you're looking to replace that role, that's maybe I would suggest, at least right now where I'm sitting, that's a big focus for that kind of capability.
Do you see the product manager as part of the customer engagement strategy?
Naturally, yes, because you've already got the advisory council apparatus built. That's who we would be going to for feedback traditionally for those types of things anyways. But I don't think that individual is going to have a lot of time. You're going to have to figure out customer service. Maybe it's like a separate role or a shared role between UEN and UTN. UTN, is it a business development kind of a role where you got folks that are spending, you already meet with your customers on a regular basis anyway. The advisory council is very useful, but is there more we should be doing as far as customer advisory, surveys, or sitting with those folks and trying to figure it out is a good question. I think you would consume the director too much if you expected them to take that on by themselves.
So kind of going back to the funding part, I didn't explain myself very well. I think that in order to have long-term viability, there needs to be a value placed on the services that are provided. It feels very vulnerable if UTN is dependent upon philanthropy of a donation from an organization, and it's not really tied to the value that they're extracting from the service. So for long-term sustainability, it seems to me that one of the strategies we should place is creating a value stream and then commoditizing or however you want to say this, so that when someone accesses a service, there's a value associated and there's sustainability. We wouldn't want to have UTN's long-term viability dependent upon donors. It just doesn't feel like a sustainable approach. So that's what I'm kind of getting back to. There was a discussion about that some time ago, and I think that may be a good thing to have part of our plan going forward.
I just want to clarify, I didn't put him up to that, to bring that up.
Okay. No, it's fine. I mean, we understand, but I think for the long-term viability, we need to have some sort of a revenue stream that's attached to value taken from that.
Yeah, 100%. I think if we do a better job of communicating to all parties what we're actually doing today in terms of the safety net IT apparatus and the philanthropy thing, it's token as it is, right? It's not enough, right? So even if we did all of that, we'll still have a very tenuous footing, where a little change here or there in pricing or discount or programs or whatever could throw a real wrench in the works, and we're kind of back to where we started. We're acknowledging that. So it's really just about slightly improving the messaging, slightly shoring up where we can some revenues through subsidy or whatever there, but getting us to a place but we realize that's not going to solve the problem. So we talked about some of the opportunities to expand services. If we gain some of those, it's twofold. It's through partnership and that neutral convener role. So what can we do to support Department of Health, Department of Education, healthcare partners, in their missions, or just bring that together, because we'll act as that. Knowing where technology is going to evolve, something's always going to break, right? So you need somebody to support and help smooth out that friction. We can help support and smooth out that friction where the rural communities today are concerned, right? So if there's reason for that to happen, like I said, because of something boards of education or health want to do, or something that the healthcare providers themselves, they'll be more self-determined, so they'll know what they want to do. But as a result, there's potential funding for services there, because we will be providing a very real service, right? We're the ones who fix it when it breaks. Back to your, rural hypertensive patient who's in his home, when they need help making their little gadget work, we help, right? So there's value in their service that's more funding. But then back into the existing our captive customer base, these types of things were things we came up with that we should be exploring with them to say, hey, in addition to, and they brought it to us, like for instance on the security side. Yeah, you gave me a vulnerability scan, but you didn't tell me what to do next, right? Okay, that's a service I can offer and charge for, but I need to have bandwidth and people to do that. So, yeah, I agree 100%. So I think we can attach this, kind of, I guess that's on three fronts: rationalizing and improving the message around what we're currently doing, knowing that that's only going to be an incremental improvement and not keep us solvent long term. Adding new services to our existing customer base, like what's on this slide, is for example. That probably would keep us solvent if we got really good at this. That Alliance Chicago organization, there's a slide on them that I mentioned. This is what they do, and they're national. And then the neutral convener role, there's opportunity for us to gain funding for services supporting broadly what we're calling currently unowned, because they're not completely owned. Use cases and opportunities, whether that's mental health in schools, IVs and chronic care, those types of things. So. Yeah, but we went over it. We appreciate the extra time. Happy to answer any questions as a follow-up to this once you guys have had time to review the material. If you do so, Ray, just let us know where to go next from here.
I just want the board to know that the Burwood Group, they've been excellent to work with, and I really appreciate that. Our intent is to follow up now that they've reported to you as a board. If there are things that you still have questions on, please let us know. The real question is, okay, now what are our next steps? And
Yes.
getting guidance to help us to make sure this isn't just a report that ends up on the shelf.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I don't know, maybe a motion to be ordered that we propose that there be some kind of response that UETN come up to the Berwick group that would indicate how they plan to go forward and implement the recommendations.
Was that a motion to
That's
the chairman?
a proposed motion.
So there's a proposed motion on the table to, as Steve mentioned, to have a report come back to us. Any discussion, thoughts?
I'd second the motion.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay. So we'll look forward to a report from UTN and on the recommendations. Thanks. Excuse me. Let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the agenda then. And thank you again, John.
We appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
I'll step up.
Okay. Minutes, are there any motion on the minutes?
Move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Let's go on to the connectivity policy then. This is coming back to us for action. We've had some time to review it. There's the connection policy for our approval as well as the participation agreement. Any discussion on this? Any concerns? Has everybody read it?
Exactly.
Read it, discussed it lots of times.
There aren't any changes from the last meeting, I will say that.
We have all seen it. Are there any motions then?
I move to approve the connection policy as written.
It's been moved to approve the connection policy as written.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. So the connection,
Kelly, wasn't it?
I just was here for questions. If there were questions, I was ready.
any motion on the participation agreement?
I make a motion to approve the participation agreement.
Okay, it's been moved.
I second that.
It's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. Let's move on to the Utah futures then. And that discussion on the Utah futures.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and lead that discussion. I just wanted you to be aware that at the last legislative session, there was a bill that passed that transferred the oversight of Utah futures to what is it again? Talent Ready Utah was transferred to Talent Ready Utah effective July 1 of 2020. So The Utah Futures Advisory Group is still has oversight of it, and we have been asked by the governor to manage Utah Futures. But this will transfer it over to Talent Ready Utah, which is a part of GOED, the Governor's Office of Economic Development. That creates some problems for us in the fact that if we continue to manage Utah Futures and we have another board telling us and managing us, they're managing and making decisions and stepping beyond your authority to have oversight of us. That creates some concern for me that we allow that to happen. What Talent Ready Utah has done is they're not waiting for July 1 to start taking action. They've already made the decision to go out with an RFP and see what's available and see what could replace Utah Futures, potentially replace it. They've asked us to respond to the RFP. And as a state entity, we don't respond to RFPs, especially if it's coming from another governmental organization. We would enter into a memorandum of understanding and usually do that, and that's what we've been doing with Utah Futures in the past. So the concern there, we took it to legal, and they're very adamant that as a state entity we should not be responding to an RFP. It sets a precedence that they feel is unhealthy and is not legally sound for us to do so. And so the decision needs to be made by this board. The reason why it's being brought to you, it's not a day-to-day operational decision. I make those decisions. This is a setting direction. And as a board, if you want us to respond to the RFP, that sends us in a different direction than we've ever gone before. And so I felt like the board needs to take action in giving us the direction of whether or not we respond to RFPs or we not respond to RFPs. And it would be my recommendation that we follow the advice of legal counsel not to respond to the RFP.
As a public entity, that seems strange that we would be responding to an RFP from another government entity. I think maybe what we could do is say we would be happy to respond to the memorandum of understanding, but we don't, as a government entity, according to what our legal counsel has given to us, respond to RFPs. And I think that would be a good way to go forward. So we're not saying we're not interested, but we're not going to respond to an RFP. Does that sound okay?
I think that my advice would be to not respond with an RFP, but let them know that sure, UEN is interested in collaborating with them, working with them, giving guidance and advice and support and doing all the things to collaborate with them. I guess when I first heard about this, my heart just went a little thump because this has been UEN's newborn baby for a long, long time. It hasn't had the funding that we have wanted. We'd rather have permanent, ongoing funding, and now it sort of feels like it's been adopted out by someone else. But hopefully, we can have joint custody of this if we can do it right and still feel like you've got good access to the various databases that are there, Learning Express, all the different things that students out there in Utah can still have all those resources. I don't know that I think it matters to us, but I don't know if it matters so much as long as students are still getting good value out of the resources that are there. I will say I appreciate Laura's efforts in helping this go forward so many years, and I think that probably her efforts or leadership is what has carried it as long as it has, and I would like to encourage Laura to try to continue and be a part of that collaborative team so that you can give them guidance and they can say, yeah, this database is really important to us, or this has really helped our students in the past, so it doesn't become a completely different offering over time.
So I would certainly advocate for us to follow the advice of council. I guess a question that I would add is, how many boards in governing bodies are now involved with Utah Futures, or going to be? I mean, we have our board. There's a board associated with Utah Futures, kind of a board. There's Talent Ready Utah, ultimately GoEd. What's this governing structure going to look like? It sounds like a beautiful government bureaucracy involved in the direction of Utah Futures. Is there a board that's going to step back, one that's going to step forward? How is that going to work? Don't know. I would just say that that's something that we should be paying attention to. And Ray, you alluded to the fact that you had some concerns, and I certainly do also. What would be our role and direction needs to be set. So I would echo the concerns that I think I felt that you had expressed. So.
I don't know what the underlying motivation for doing this is. Totally understand it, but I think we should follow legal counsel as well. And this really is a violation of the organizational principle of unity of command. I mean, there's so many fingers in this pie, it's just going to be a disaster. But yet the students need analytics to make good decisions about their careers. This is a nice side, it outlines it all. I just cannot understand why we have a hard time making this stick.
I don't understand why they want to do an RFP when they haven't got funding in the first place. And that's sort of the crux of it. There's no funding going forward after this fiscal year. They're going to do an RFP for something they have no funding for.
We've been meeting with Silicon Slopes people that are just crying for some way to get people into their jobs out there, and there are just a lot of people that want to do it, but it doesn't seem to be coming together in such a way that it's really happening and helping them.
It does seem like in the MOU approach that we could at least provide what we are currently doing and what the costs are associated with it as part of the MOU, and say this is what we're doing and this is our cost. And if you take it away, that's whatever, but at least this is what we're doing and this is our cost. I like the MOU approach of defining that, and I obviously haven't read an RFP, but if they're asking for additional services in that MOU, we could possibly say, well, we could provide other additional services for some sort of a cost, but I agree. We have to follow legal counsel.
Would there be
the RFP per se?
Yeah, would there be an opportunity within an MOU to perhaps address the governing questions and what our role would be in any sort of governing line?
I think that's essential.
Maybe use the MOU to not only talk about the services that we provide, but also within the MOU to address governance.
I think that's the decision from Talent Ready Utah, from their board, whether they're willing to do that. I don't know if they are.
Ray?
Yes, Tammy?
Okay, can I just weigh in on this? I'm sorry, I can't see who's poised to speak next, but I agree with something that Robert had said about kind of the growing bureaucracy of the governance model, and we've battled this for 6+ years that I've been on board, and I'm not sure how much longer than that, but it seems like it's going a different direction, and my advice, despite fighting this battle and leading the charge many years, rather than to try and accommodate and address maybe still a collaborative partnership in an MOU or whatever, is to just not respond to the RFP as has been advised, and let let a new entity take it over, and it's just so difficult. It's been very difficult. The lack of funding, the ever-changing, moving the target every year on what they want, and it's just been difficult. And I've been really disappointed, especially with an article that came out earlier this week on not being able to find a certain item on career majors and how much they pay, and Utah Futures kind of being blamed somewhat in that article when they never even called us. The article is not accurate. No one called so that we could direct them, to that information quite easily, and yet I think it reflects poorly on UEN for no cause of our own, and it's just going to continue to be very difficult to manage all of the entities involved. And if the legislature wants to fund this, they're going to have to do it their own way, and I think this is their own way to do it, is put out an RFP, find another entity, find who can do it for the amount that they want to pay, and frankly, I don't know that we can do it for the amount that they're willing to pay. So I don't think it's going to be $1.6 million, and so as closely as I've been aligned to this, I'm ready to just let it go and not respond, especially based on the recommendations from your legal team. That's all I have to say.
Motion.
Sounds good. Is there a motion?
Is that a motion, Tammy?
Yeah, was that a motion?
I'm not going to make that motion, but I'll vote on a motion.
That's the cut bait motion.
This is unfortunate because already, there have been so many false starts on Utah Futures over the years when it's been tried to be directed out of the legislature specifically, and it's always failed when until UEN took it over, it wasn't successful because everybody tried to underbid it and never could provide the service. It was useless until just a few years ago, frankly, because of the same approach. And I kind of agree. It's a no-win situation moving forward.
So I'd agree to respond and say we're going to follow the advice of counsel and not do an MOU only if there are no longer going to be expectations for UEN's involvement with Utah Futures. But if there are going to continue to be some expectations, whatever they might be, I think we're going to need some agreement in place to clearly specify what those responsibilities are. So if it's looking like this is moving away from UEN, I would let it go, but if there's still going to be expectations for our involvement, I think it's in our best interest to clarify what that involvement is.
So how would you...
Can I ask another question? And that is, do we have to respond actively and say we're not going to respond to the RFP, or do we just not respond? I'm a little bit worried about saying we're not responding due to advice from our counsel, because a couple of the legislators involved disagree with that advice and say, you're wrong, you can respond, and they would argue that, if that's the only reason we're not responding, they would argue that we're getting bad advice. So I would just say, if asked, that factored into the decision, but overall there's just some governance issues and kind of the growing, complications of who's really going to steer the ship versus do the work. I mean, if it were me, I would just not respond to the RFP.
Laura?
Well, first, I want to say thank you to this board for your support all these many years with this project. It's been a learning experience for everybody. In addition to the concerns expressed by legal counsel, there are some reputational concerns that we have as UETN. One in particular is, if we do respond to the RFP, we would be essentially competing with our own vendors for that service. And because so much of the work that my team has been doing lately is focused on working with the vendor community and trying to make really good relationships there, I think having that reputation as of you knew about our pricing and then you turn around and competed against us, it just has some ethical concerns that
I definitely agree
that I'm
that
worried
you
about.
should not respond to the RFP, whether or not you tell them you're not gonna respond, or whether or not, or you just don't respond. I don't believe that you should make an attempt to respond to their RFP. I would love to see Laura Hunter on their advisory board or work with them in some way to provide some kind of continuity and transition. I guess I'm worried for people if we've got a product that we've had and it's had some challenges as funding, but if it goes in a completely different direction all of a sudden because we don't have any continuity of leadership, for me that feels like a problem for the people that we serve.
So Tammy, how would that be if we said we are not going to respond, or can you put that into a motion that we feel UETN should not respond to this RFP request?
I'm a little hesitant to be the person making that motion, but I think whoever makes that motion could say, due to a variety of factors, we're reluctant to respond, but are happy to help during a transition to a new entity. And I like that advice about helping with the transition. I would just not like to be on the hook beyond a transition point for things that we were doing well all along, but the legislature wanted to go in a different direction. So.
Okay, so I'll make a motion then that we not respond to the RFP, but would be happy to help them in the transition of moving Utah Futures into whatever it is they want to do with it. Does that sound all right?
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded that we not respond but help in the transition to whoever
Takes over.
Takes over. Any other?
Takes over that responsibility from us. Right.
Thanks. Any?
So that would be a governance. So take over governance of the.
It's going to move on July 1, right?
Yeah, governance and operation.
But so I guess I'm confused then. Is effective July 1st, will UETN then no longer have anything to do with, or will we continue to provide services and serve
We don't know
the
that.
platform itself?
We don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
It depends upon if they select someone else through the RFP process, then they take it to the legislature to get the funding, and then if they get the funding, then where does it go from there? We don't know.
Okay.
Not yet.
See, and that's what I'm concerned about, is that we clarify, but that's for future. It sounds like there's a lot of other things that have to happen before we get to that point, but given there's so many governing bodies in the mix, I would at some point, when appropriate, encourage us to get in writing what it is that what expectations they have for us and our involvement with Utah Futures.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that we are not requesting any funding at all for Utah Futures. So they're not on the request, and they're working off of one-time dollars right now. So their dollars dry up, Dollars dry up.
So Robert, I appreciate what you said.
No, and that's just part of it. I had just meant that to be part of the discussion phase. I'm supportive of the motion that was moved and seconded. I just wanted to mention that as part of the discussion for
future.
Once this becomes a little more clear on what's going to happen and how it's going to work, if our involvement will continue in some way, let's get it in writing. That's all.
All right. Sounds good.
So there's a motion and a second on the table. Any other discussion and clarification?
Can we add that, get it in writing part to the motion, just so that that doesn't get lost? I'm sure it's in our minutes, but I think that's an important component of that, so maybe amend the motion just to add that part that as this transitions, the expectations are clearly articulated, defined, and written.
Okay, so if it restated, then the motion would be that we not respond to the RFP, that we'd be happy to help in the transition of moving Utah Futures to Talent Ready Utah, is that right? And that if there are obligations that they want us to assume, that be given to us in writing. Okay.
Is the second still the second, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other clarifications? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, let's move to the software process then, discussing things. Attached to the agenda is process. I think, Laura, are you going to discuss this, I suspect, right?
Sure.
This is
And maybe Steve wants to weigh in. So this, as I understand it, was a request from a meeting with the CIOs and the CAOs together to identify what's the process when we're working with higher ed and public ed, mostly higher ed in this case, to do consortium software licensing. And so over the past few months, I've been working with members of the UTTC group, the Teaching Technologies Council, and they have representation of the CAOs and the CIOs on that group to document the draft that you have in front of you. So this is for discussion and to get some input. I actually don't know if it's something that the board should act on because it's more of a business process, but I think it's helpful to have it documented to kind of take the mystery out of how we make these decisions. And hopefully you'll see in the written version, so there's three kind of concentric circles, and this was taken from a couple other universities. They view common good services, so these are things that typically the legislature pays for and nearly every one of the institutions uses. So Canvas would be a good example of a common good service. And then there are goodwill services, which we negotiate a reduced price, but institutions opt in or not. So an example of that might be Turnitin or some of the other tools that people opt in or out, but it's not paid by the legislature, it's not a core service. And then of course there are individual products that institutions license on their own. And then the process for making those selection, there's a graph there that describes that process. So I don't know if you want to take time now to discuss that or if you want to just discuss it over the next few months, and we can bring it back to the committee in December.
I just want to say the CIOs did look at the process and they like it. I think the only question they had is there's also a process that the CIOs have in place for the purchase of software. And when it comes to negotiating software, I guess the key element would be with UETN is that when it involves K through all higher education, then we're very happy to work that way. But there are some other kinds of things that, like our Adobe agreement, Microsoft, Banner, and all the other things that we sign up with that don't involve UETN. So I think with the stipulation that when it is covers the entire scope of K through 12, we'd love to have you help us buy Banner and PeopleSoft too. Do you know what I mean? That's the only thing I think we would need to kind of get in writing as well. But
Okay.
we really appreciate what you do to help in the acquisition of purchase of software.
And historically, I don't know that it was a K-12 versus higher ed division. It was more of instructional versus more administrative tools.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, I fully support getting this process down on paper, and because as a higher ed institution, we have benefited from this for a long, long time. The only thing as I looked at this that I would maybe add or at least think about is one of the one of the challenges that we face when we do consortium licensing, that at least I've experienced, is every USHE institution's purchasing department is different and often considers that consortium, the consortium participation differently, and there are different levels of consortium participation. There's one where we all sign the same contract. There's another where we all benefit from similar pricing. We have experience with different types of consortium models. Sometimes those confuse and create some challenges for the USHE purchasing, the separate purchasing offices. So somewhere in there to maybe just address and work with the individual purchasing offices. I've had the experience where I felt like we've had 3 or 4 institutions on board, and then at least 1 or 2 of them have gotten stuck with the purchasing department. And granted, they're trying to follow state law, and I appreciate that, but sometimes there's different interpretations of state law within the procurement realm. And so being able to address that and the different types of consortium models that we have.
I'm just wondering if this all addresses higher ed and K-12. The state libraries oftentimes purchase things in connection with those groups, and I don't know whether the state library is mentioned in this or whether that's just assumed. For example, we all purchase EBSCO databases and ProQuest and other databases that are for public libraries, academic libraries, and school libraries. I don't know where the state library's role is in that, or if it's just sort of assumed it is in there.
It could be more explicit. That's good.
So one of the things that has sometimes been a problem, and maybe would be nice to maybe define, and this goes along with Robert, but internal to making a purchase at an institution, just our institution, the purchasing has to be kind of sign off and say, yeah, we're okay with this, and that could include a contracts office as part of that or whatever who has that contract. If we buy something, that has to go through that process. If it's a technology purchase, technology leadership has to sign off on something. If it costs money, somebody has to sign off that they have the money and actually have the money. And then there's the service area who wants it and says, yeah, we want it. And sometimes what happens, I think, that I've seen is the service area goes, yeah, we want it. But there's no funding. It hasn't reviewed by purchasing. And the technical implementation hasn't been discussed at all. And so I wonder if there's a way to kind of say, you mentioned here, approved by, the relevant people at the college or in institutions or school districts, et cetera. Can we spell those different areas out to say these are the ones we're going to get sign off on, or make sure that, is this sign off the service area being excited about it, or is this a sign off on yes we have money, or is this a sign off by the technical area that says yes, we're good to implement this, and is it a sign off by purchasing? Because internally that happens on these purchases, and I think that's every time we've run into a problem with the purchasing process, it seems like it's because one of those areas says, wait,
I agree.
Whether it's purchasing or sometimes, recently, there was a joint purchase. It wasn't actually done through UETN, but through USHE, and it's like the technical, it's like, hey, we bought this and now implement it. It's like, we haven't even been included in the conversation. But anyway, just
so, along those same lines, I'd just like to see maybe a chart or even a flow chart with this write-up to kind of define those roles and how we purchase in different situations.
Any other input?
We just passed a policy on enterprise software acquisitions on campus, and we have a document that maybe that it takes into inclusion the total cost of ownership, integration issues, and how those are being addressed and what it would cost. That might be, I don't know how that fits in, and I'd have to think about that a little bit, but that might be something that could be added a little bit to the document.
Yeah, and this has been a helpful discussion. Laura Busby, who's the CAO representative to the committee, shared with me UVU's process document, and so when in that line that says we're assuming someone on the campus level is getting approval from the proper authority, that they know who their proper authority is because it varies on every single campus. So we have, I think, sewn up some of those processes by having that participation agreement and room for multiple signatures. So whoever's going through that at their campus level knows who needs to sign off and what their process is that's specific to them.
Yeah, on the university campus, it's me and the party or the dean or otherwise who's going to put up money for it. So I think, is that true on your campus as well, at UVU?
It goes through, there's a committee. But, yeah.
But I think, if we could just talk about this a little bit more and kind of put some of those nuances, and I think that would really strengthen the document. But boy, we appreciate the help on some of these software contracts.
Thanks for that.
Okay. Thanks. Let's go ahead and then move on to the policy discussion regarding closed captioning, diversity, public broadcasting, and website accessibility, and reaffirming these on a regular basis. I think we have to review these and be aware of them, especially too.
Exactly. So this is a discussion item, and we'll bring it forward for action at our next meeting. But some of you that have been around for a while know we need to document that the board is reaffirming support for some of these policies, and these in particular are tied to our role as a public broadcaster. So every year Ray needs to verify with them that the board is supportive of these specific policies. So they're linked here for you to review, and then we'll bring it forward for action in December. They have not changed since the last time the board acted on them.
And do you feel that are in need of closer review?
Good question. No, but based on feedback from the board with our EBSCO situation last year, we're building on the public broadcasting editorial integrity policy to help develop the process through which members of the public could request a review of content. So that's a new policy that would be attached to this, kind of an expansion.
Anything on the web accessibility changes because of the ups and downs there? I mean, obviously, it seems like people are saying, no, we need to be more proactive instead of reactive on those types of things. Does that need to change at all?
That's a question that I think I have for all of you.
I know from a standpoint of there's a lot of pressure across higher ed, at least, to say, be proactive on accessibilities instead of saying, well, fix the problems or we're working on the problems. It's like, don't purchase something unless it's already accessible.
This policy I did compare to what Utah.gov and the State Board of Education have, just the standard language. It's consistent with those. But yes, I agree.
So maybe adding a statement about we're trying to be proactive.
Okay.
I think that's one of the things in education, especially. It seems like the educational area has been under a lot of pressure to if it's student facing, then it's got to be accessible up front rather than providing accommodations after.
YCAG 2.0 and having the standard, yeah.
Sometimes interesting, this notion of accessibility. A vendor will even sign off, yes, we're fully accessible, and yet I work in the same building as the Division of Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and have often gone to one of their gals that is only in Braille, that does not have a monitor for her screen because she doesn't need it. She uses screen reading software, and what might seem like a vendor could sign off as being totally accessible, that is not accessible to that individual. So it's just interesting. Sometimes things get through that probably shouldn't have gotten through because they weren't well vetted by people that are actually needing to use the products. And I don't know that we would have control. You would have control over that, but accessibility should be, I think, vetted in some way. Is this truly accessible? Could a student who does use accessible types of things try it, or a group that does that try it before we just assume, oh, they said it was, so we bought it, and it's not.
That's part of the proactive part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just wonder, maybe something about purchasing new web-based services or purchasing new products might be good to add to that. Obviously, because those things that we're in control of, we do our best to make them accessible and try to review them, and we are responsible for them. And that you can't be proactive in something that already exists, right? But you can if we're buying something new that's going to become part of our web services, if you will.
And meeting minimum standards, or there's expectations around that. Yeah. Helpful. Okay, we'll bring these to the December meeting for action, and let me know if there's any other feedback.
Thanks. Executive Director's report.
Okay, I have one thing that I want to share with you, and it's the legislative funding request. You have online there the one-page document that we use as we work with our legislators. The end of the last legislative session was really quite a scramble as they moved our funding and changed our funding a little bit because they wanted to address tax reform. We found out just recently, because all of the numbers were all mixed up, we got a little more clarity. What they actually did is they reduced our base budget by $822,000. And we were not aware of that. We weren't told that's what had happened, and Lisa figured it out finally, that that's what happened. And then they took the equipment replacement dollars that was recommended to be ongoing, and they gave it to us as one time. So the top priority, number one, is that we have our base budget restored, and that the equipment replacement dollars be put back in as ongoing funding. That's the first thing that we absolutely need to do. Then the second thing is the request for a new appropriation. And we only have two requests, but they're broken up into multiple subparts. Growth and operations is always the first thing that we need. We need to make sure that we're covering all of the new schools and changes to our stakeholders there. We have backbone upgrades that we need to make because of increased utilization. We need to be able to have greater capacity. Telehealth, the operational funding for telehealth. We've got a request in there for that. And then we were asking for funding to connect public libraries. We're now to the point where we've evolved from requesting that funding for schools, and we have all of our schools being funded. We're seeing a huge homework gap with the haves versus the have-nots. Those who have internet connectivity in their homes, they can take the laptop from school, they can go home, they can work on their assignments. But those families that don't really don't have a very good option. And the one option that we know they do have is to go to their local public library where they can access the internet there. But many of our libraries have very limited or low bandwidth, and they have no appropriation for that. So we're asking for funding to be able to take those public libraries that connect through us right now and we go ahead and get the funding, and we go ahead and connect them and pay those costs for those public libraries. That's going to be a two-phase thing. It would be the ones that we work with right now that are already connected through us, but they're having to pay their own way, which is a struggle for them. And then phase 2 the following year would be the remainder of those public libraries that come to us and would like to connect through us. And then the other thing that we need, that we're asking for under that growth and operations, is funding for the tools, the software tools that we need to be able to monitor and measure the network performance. And so that's what we're looking at for that part. And then number 2, consortium software. You've had the discussion of how much we save by purchasing statewide licenses and working as a consortium. Well, the same thing goes here. We know that K-12 has full funding for Canvas. That was appropriated through the legislature at the request of the State Board of Education. Higher ed, however, is only about a third funded, and then they have to come up and pay the other 2/3. So if you look on page 2 of that the double-sided handout, you'll see that the circle graph there, the green shows how much is funded for higher ed, and what we're proposing is that we now take 2 phases to have full funding for higher ed and UTEC. Phase 1 would be about $800,000. We were asking for this session to have the legislature cover the cost for Canvas. And then next year, the following year, we would go and ask for phase 2 so that eventually the full $2.55 million would be covered, just as it is with K-12. And then we have parity there. So that's the first software piece that we're looking at. The second software piece is the interactive learning platform. And just as we've, with the learning management system, we've identified Canvas, with the interactive learning platform, we've identified Nearpod. Laura, is that almost half of the districts, or am I exaggerating on that? How many are using Nearpod at this point?
Oh, I would say nearly
Nearly
about
half.
right.
Nearly half of the districts are using that, and that is a
More
tool.
would use it if it was funded.
Yeah.
If they could afford it.
So we're asking for the legislature to fund that interactive learning platform, and that just fits hand in hand with the digital teaching and learning program that's in every district right now. So that's the change you see on that. We have all of the names of the locations where the upgrades need to be made, all of the new schools that need to be connected, and then we have those funding requests on that. So I don't know if you have questions on the layout or anything that we've stated there, I'd be happy to answer any of those questions.
Ray, would it be helpful with the libraries particularly to have some kind of a graph that shows how much they're currently paying and what connectivity that they're currently getting? And with this, how much they would be paying and it would be $375,000, but how much more connectivity that would equal?
That would be very helpful. Yes, absolutely.
And perhaps the same on the licensing for Nearpod, where half of the schools, how much is being paid, but by this happening, everybody would be able to do it.
And that's on there, right? You've got
Right, yeah, if you look at the bar chart, you can see if they all went out and licensed by themselves.
Then that's fine, I think, but something for the libraries, I think, would be really helpful. I don't think that will resonate as quickly unless they can see that, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Rick, this request for the libraries will not take the libraries up to a gig or anything else. It is just to replace what they're currently paying. And our goal was to kind of phase it into, and I think that what to me is what makes it so important is that we have these libraries, and we've got pricing for a gig, and it's only going to cost them additional $100 a month or something like that. They don't have it within their budget to pay it, and so they'll accept lesser bandwidth just because. And so this is just going to make them so that if that makes sense. We have not put it up to UETN standards here. the demand
But
standard.
it would
That
be a
makes
lot
sense.
easier to do that.
Well,
going
they're
forward.
currently under existing contract. Our goal
Right.
would be when the contracts expire to automatically do that. And I think with the cost that we have,
Well, the
the
cost that
pricing
we
we're
would pay.
achieving now, that they'll.
And we could build that into the growth
Right.
factor when we request for growth.
Agreed, yeah.
You know, when the contracts come up, this number of libraries we want to upgrade.
So
That's
are
not-
we gonna pay for the upgrade of the whole thing?
What's that?
Are we gonna pay for the upgrade to the public libraries so they continue to contribute, or do we gotta take over the?
We're taking over their costs right now. That's what we're proposing right now with this.
Yeah.
But in time, we'd be able to get more of it. Capacity at work. That's all.
So this is taking over their costs right now, but at what part of the phase would we work to get the libraries up to 1 gig that don't have it?
When their contracts come.
They're
Yeah.
they're all under contract, and that's the key. Phase 1, they're all under contract with UETN, and they're the ones who, regardless of whatever. So we do have to honor the current contract we currently have.
We
We can see what, you know, you can kind of, depending on location, we can look to see what we can do. But they're all on existing contract right now.
So you'll phase it in as the contract
Well,
goes
phase
in?
it, that's what our goal was, is just to phase it in when the contract expired. That's what we originally internally talked about, just honoring the contracts and when they come up. And I just don't know when they're coming up, to be
Similar
honest.
to the process we used for the elementary schools over the past few years.
You know,
On the LMS, I certainly appreciate the logic that's being presented as far as parity goes. The only thing that I would add is maybe in your paragraph, just continue to mention the fact that although the purpose of this request is for parity, to not forget that the consortium pricing model does realize the state significant cost savings. And to not lose sight, you make that point very, very well with the Nearpod in showing the savings that state entities are. Well, that continues to be the case with Canvas. Each of the USHE institutions, K through 12, we all benefit from significant cost savings because of the consortium model. So maybe a sentence just in that paragraph to continue to note the fact that this is a significant benefit to the estate.
Now, the priority 1, 2 also is that is the priority. You're going for priority 1
Yes.
and 2.
Yes.
And the network monitoring equipment, Jim, what does that entail?
It entails the being able to put in the telemetry capabilities instead of telemetry is the replacement for SNMP for monitoring. And so that is collecting the data, but also the software and capabilities of being able to analyze that. And there's so much more data with that. But that's the next direction, and we have to be able to move to that telemetry to be able to show what's going on with the network performance. So it's all the hardware to collect the telemetry, to house it, and then the software to analyze it and put that in place to be able to make decisions based on that information that we get.
Can you name a tool that might do that you might have?
Yes, Blue Planet is one of the plan, and we did purchase one of the modules, the route optimization of Blue Planet. It's a Sienna product and something that we're working with.
Okay.
Thanks. The advisory council hasn't, UEN advisory council didn't meet, right?
We did not meet. We did not have enough significant agenda items
Yeah.
to pull everybody together, which is good.
Is there any, Deb, you want to talk for the
Just very quickly.
UTN?
So we did have a retreat on October 3rd. Burwood Group was the primary party, but about half of it. The other half, and we had about 30 participants, so it included our advisory councils, member sites, and interested healthcare entities in the community. There were some. We kind of went through and just had people talk about new telehealth applications they've added in the last year, and one that might be of interest to this group is that there's been an emphasis on oral health in the schools, and there's a program called Smart Smiles where they go in with dental hygienists and actually do cleanings in some of the schools, and then do telehealth to reach a dentist to figure out whether that patient needs to be followed up. So it's a little, and it seems like it's happening between the area. I think it was 6 school districts from Ogden to Jordan. So anyway, that was kind of interesting. And then there's a huge interest in the telehealth community on improving reimbursement for telehealth because it's just killing us. And there was a big discussion on that. And clearly we can't do anything with the legislature ourselves, but we can convene the community. And so there was a lot of discussion about what the needs are, and there may be some legislation that comes through led by members of our network, but not us. And so it was an opportunity to try to get that organized a little bit. So those were the 2 main things, and then of course Barwood.
Any questions on that? And then Gary, do you want to talk about the Technology Advisory Committee? You're still muted. Can't hear you.
I can go ahead and report on that.
Go ahead, Jim.
We've had 2 TAC meetings since the last board meeting. In the first one, we reviewed the Internet Registry information that we'd shared with the board on August 16th and really reemphasized what we're trying to do there. Got validation that we're on the right track and got a lot of support from the group on that. And then in this most recent September meeting, we talked about and had Lisa and Mike come in and talk about the RFP process and the RFI process and talk over that, and that was a very good discussion. As part of this, talked about some of the technical ins and outs of Eduroam and got some advice from there. Got a lot of good, it's fun to have a group that really wants to get down and talk about all the geeky technical stuff, so I'm very much enjoying that.
Thanks, Jim. EBSCO report is online there. Any questions regarding the quarterly reports that we are reviewing each quarter?
We're okay, I guess.
Good. Looks like we're doing okay.
I think the word graphs are really interesting.
They are interesting, aren't they?
Got to figure out I guess that's about the prisoner of cell 25. Big time in Nebo School District. And head injuries, I think, or brain injuries with sports, especially fall sports. It's really sort of fascinating to see what kids are searching.
Yes. There's the proposed 2020 schedule. It's proposed the meetings in the coming year being February 21st, looking at the retreat for April 24th, June 19th, August 22nd, October 24th, and December 9th. Any concerns, questions?
I think
Where we
October.
review those?
I think October is the 23rd, isn't it?
It is. That would be, unless you're going to meet on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Little typo there.
I would just ask that we leave the open for a couple more months looking. I appreciate the word possibly retreat, so we could maybe look at the best day for the retreat in future discussions. That would be great.
And I think we should have it in Logan.
Would
we could get
love
some
to have
Aggie ice cream.
Aggie ice cream will be provided. So.
Oh, that we're going.
Sounds great. Okay. Next item, next meeting is December 4th. And there's some additional items there for the board to review, just FYI, regarding some of the conferences and summits coming up. I just shout out for St. Con, obviously this month. So, any other business that needs to come before the board? And I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Moved.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thanks.
Meeting